we welcome you to tonight's event, The Fine Art of Temptation, C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. We would like to thank the co-sponsor and host for tonight's event, Houston Baptist University and the Honor College. This event is part of Crossroads series, Beauty Will Save the World. Crossroads Cultural Center values beauty in the world of arts because it is such an essential and necessary dimension of being human. Beauty sparks the wonder and attraction at the origin of human experience and reality. According to Lewis, reality itself is the instrument through which God calls man to himself, so much so that the devil's main trick is to pull man away from it. The format of tonight's event: first, Dr. Aquila, the Provost of the University of St. Thomas, a member of Crossroads Board of Directors, will introduce the Screwtape Letters and the work of Crossroads. Then, through dramatic reading and commentary, Dr. Markos, a professor of English and scholar-in-residence at Houston Baptist University, and an accomplished lecturer and the author of several books, will guide us through the correspondence of worldly wise old Devil Screwtape to his nephew Wormwood, a novice demon in charge of securing the damnation of the ordinary young man. We invite you to read our wonderful speaker's full bio in our program. First, Dr. Phil Talon, who is also from the Honor College, will welcome us.
Everybody, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Houston Baptist University to lovely Wheelan Chapel on this beautiful evening. I'd like to say thank you to our students for being here on what is undoubtedly a night when you could be studying or getting work done or goofing off and coming here to enrich your mind and further your learning. And I'd like to say a special warm welcome to those of you in the community who have come here. We're so glad to have you here, and so Houston Baptist welcomes you. If you are a fan of C.S. Lewis and from the community, I'd like to tell you about a new program that we have here. It's a Master's in the Arts in Apologetics. And you have the opportunity, if you're interested, to study on campus or online, and to learn to do cultural apologetics in the way that C.S. Lewis did through works like the Screwtape Letters. If you're a young person, so I think I've seen a few of you around, and you're a fan of C.S. Lewis or you're a fan of Dr. Lou Markos, I'd like to invite you to find out more about our Honors College. You'll get to hear Dr. Markos give the kind of engaging lecture he gives tonight on a regular basis, and you'll also read the great works of Western literature that informed the mind that wrote the Screwtape Letters. Thank you so much for your time, and I'd like to welcome now Dr. Aquila, who will come and share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here this evening to introduce Dr. Markos and C.S. Lewis, who I absolutely adored my entire life. I think, like many people, sometimes I take this for granted, C.S. Lewis was an enormously formative influence in my life. As a boy growing up in Brooklyn, across the river from New Jersey, I found great satisfaction in reading comic books, but also Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And the formation that C.S. Lewis, I read everything that I could read as a teenager of C.S. Lewis. But the perhaps greatest impact and a resource for me occurred at September 11, 2001. In 2001, on September 11th, we were just opening a new university in Michigan, Ave Maria University, and I was the founding provost. We were beginning classes that day, September 11, 2001. And as we were getting ready for the opening of a brand new college in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on the right, the news came about the terrorist attack on 9/11. And there was a great flurry of whether or not we should continue with classes. Students were coming in weeping. Young men thought for sure that they were going to be called up to a new draft. If you at all have any memory of that day, remember, nothing was certain. Everything was up for grabs, knowing what was happening. Flights were canceled, the internet was down, no one knew what to expect next, and it just seemed one calamity after another. The planes going into the buildings crumbling. What were we to do on the opening day of the university, Ave Maria University? Then I remembered C.S. Lewis's great sermon defending whether or not we should study, we should have university education in a time of war. And I went back to that speech that he gave. He gave it, of course, during World War II. And I gave a version of it, or references to it, to the opening of the student. We decided that we would go ahead and hold classes that day. And I defended it on the ground of C.S. Lewis's sermon, justifying study, learning, what we do at a university during a time of war. And afterwards, after I excerpted parts of C.S. Lewis's sermon, the one part of it that seemed the greatest consolation to both faculty and students was Lewis in his sermon identified 3 enemies. His whole idea was that war is basically the sadness of the human condition in warp speed. Is that the human condition is one that is a fallen, a cracked image of the Creator, but that war only magnifies that and amplifies that. The third element that he said we should be wary of in a time of war, the great enemy, is fear. And it couldn't have been, and I just put it out there, resting on C.S. Lewis's genius, and that turned out to be the great consolation, because no one knew what to expect next. Everything was up for grabs. Lewis said, "War threatens us with death and pain. No man, and especially no Christian, who remember Gethsemane need try to attain a stoic indifference about these things. But we can guard against the illusions of the imagination. We think of the streets of Warsaw and contrast the death there suffered with an abstraction called life. But there is no question of death or life for any of us, only a question of this death or that, of a machine gun bullet now or a cancer 40 years later. What does war do to death? It certainly does not make it more frequent. 100% of us die, and the percentage cannot be increased. It puts several deaths earlier, but I hardly suppose that that is what we fear. Certainly, when the moment comes, it will make little difference how many years we have behind us. Does it increase our chance of a painful death? I doubt it. As far as I can find out, what we call natural death is usually preceded by suffering. And a battlefield is one of the very places where one has a reasonable prospect of dying with no pain at all. Does it decrease our chances of dying at peace with God? I cannot believe it. If active service does not persuade a man to prepare for death, what conceivable concatenation of circumstances would? Yet war does do something to death. It forces us to remember it. The only reason why the cancer at 60 or the paralysis at 75 do not bother us is that we forget them. War makes death real to us, and that would have been regarded as one of the blessings by most of the great Christians of the past. They thought it good for us to be always aware of our mortality. I'm inclined to think that they were right. And for whatever reason, grace of God only knows, that section, that reference, was a great consolation to my students at the very first day of Ave Maria University on September 11, 2001. But I only raise that here. There are some themes, I'm sure Dr. Markos showed them to us. These themes emerge in the Screwtape Letters about war, because these letters were written during the time of war. But for me, as someone who had been a great fan of C.S. Lewis, that in a time of unprecedented crisis, at least in my lifetime, although it was born on December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, I didn't live through that. So I had nothing to gauge the kind of emergency in unusual times, except to fall back on someone like C.S. Lewis. A great man like that who left us writings that I could rely on to bring consolation to a group of very fearful young men and women who did not know what would come next. And like Lewis, we decided to press on and do what we do, follow a vocation that day as teachers and students. We got past the crisis and here we are. It was not easy, but here we are. And Lewis is perennially relevant. The kind of solace, the sense of steadiness that he brought was very important to me and to my students. You're in for a great treat this evening, as I just for the first time got to talk with Dr. MARKOS and find out our common roots on the East Coast. There's probably some resemblances of upbringing, but I know this for sure. We both have a great love for this man, C.S. Lewis, and you will enjoy greatly what he has to say about it.
Mediterranean Yankees here. This is pretty scary. Wow. Let me begin by telling you a story, because again, New York, I'm from New Jersey, and I'm reminded of a story of a New York businessman who had to come down here to Houston for a business conference. Now, this man was a newlywed. He'd only been married 6 months, and this was the first time since their wedding that he was going to be apart with his wife. And he loved her terribly, and he missed her so much. And so the very moment he got to his Houston hotel room, he whipped out his laptop computer and sent her an email. Unfortunately, in his haste, he typed in the wrong address. And so, rather than going to his wife in New York, his letter went to an 85-year-old woman in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Now, this woman had been married for 60 years, and just the night before, her husband had passed away in his sleep. And she was doing well. She had a lot of support in her church and her community. But that evening, everybody noticed that that woman disappeared. Nobody knew where she was. They searched up and down the house, and then they thought, well, let's look in the study, because this was a woman who knew how to use her computer. They opened the door, and there was the poor woman passed out in front of her computer. And no one could understand why she seemed to be doing so well. And then they thought to read what was on the computer. And this is what it said: "To my dearest wife, I have arrived safely. I am awaiting your arrival next week." P.S. I suggest you wear shorts, because it's awfully hot down here. Be careful if you send emails to the right place. Now, I begin with that story because if there's one area of Christianity that makes people nervous, it's the talk of hell and the talk of devils. Aren't we past all of that? Well, Lewis, who was extremely educated, one of the most educated people of the 20th century, believed in hell and devils because they're in the Bible. And you know what? A lot of people that want to escape things in the Bible they don't like, they do this. Well, that's St. Paul. I only read the stuff written in red. You know what that means? The words of Jesus. Well, if that's your way of reading the Bible, you're out of luck. Because nobody in the Bible talks more about devils and hell than Jesus. You can't get around this. It is not the center of Christianity, but it's something there. And in the 1940s, Lewis landed on the cover of Newsweek, sort of Man of the Year, or Time, Man of the Year. And it said on the, have you ever seen the picture? It's his face, and there's little devils next to him, and it says, "His heresy, Christianity." Are you telling me in this day and age someone actually believes in devils? Well, Lewis wrote books about heaven and hell and about devils to help us to understand them. And one of his greatest books, perennially, it still sells like 1 million copies a year, is the Screwtape Letters. And it's an ingenious idea. A senior devil named Screwtape is writing a series of letters to his nephew, Wormwood, who is a junior tempter, and he's teaching them how to tempt people, how to manipulate what they call their patient, the person that they are trying to tempt. And there are 31 of these letters. They originally appeared serially in a magazine called The Guardian, and they were written in the early 40s during the war, and they were published together as Screwtape Letters. And I'm going to read a few of them to you and talk about them, but I want to give you a little background on the Screwtape Letters. First of all, in Lewis's lengthy introduction, there's lots of different editions. Some only have the 2-page introduction. Make sure you buy the one that has the 7 or 8-page introduction, because Lewis gives us a lot of background. And he explains to us, first of all, and most importantly, the devil is not the opposite of God. Right? The devil is the opposite of the Archangel Michael or Gabriel. Christians are not dualists. We do not believe there is a good God and an evil God locked in perpetual war. We believe there's one God who is all good, and that God created angels who were good, but some of them fell and became devils. And so God is up here. There is a spiritual warfare, but it's between angels and devils. It's not like Satan's going to take on God. There's not even a chance for him. He's a created being, right? So it's not dualist. It is, basically, the devils are fallen angels. See, we have this idea in our modern society that goodness means the absence of evil. If I don't do anything bad, I'm a good person. No, completely the opposite. Goodness is the primary thing. Evil and sin are a perversion or a corruption or a falling away from goodness. And Lewis does a wonderful job explaining this in almost all of his books. Another thing Lewis wants us to know before we read the Screwtape Letters. Evil is finally boring. Lewis, kind of following, I don't know if you're familiar with Hannah Arendt or perhaps Thomas Merton, they often speak of the banality of evil. See, for Lewis, real evil is not shown in, like, I don't know, New Orleans, okay? Real evil would be the Holocaust, which was run by nice men in white suits and bowler hats. I'm sure a lot of you have been to the Holocaust Museum in Houston. Do go, it's free, and go see it. Because one of the things that always shocks people the most when they go to a museum of the Holocaust is when they see that the Nazis kept absolute perfect records of all the shoes and clothing that were left behind. I mean, this kind of strange, bureaucratic evil. And for Lewis, if you read carefully, he depicts hell as a sort of nasty bureaucracy where everybody's stabbing each other in the back. And those of you that have worked in business, you know that the lower the stakes are, the nastier people get. I don't know why that is, but Lewis captures that. See, Lewis wrote a famous book called A Preface to Paradise Lost. And he fought against this romantic notion that Satan was really the hero of Paradise Lost. And yet, even though Lewis fought that, Lewis knew too that Milton maybe made a mistake in making his Satan seem so, kind of charismatic and whatnot. No, the devil is a boring person, okay? The devil is anti-life, anti-joy, anti-hope. In fact, in the Screwtape Letters, the metaphor that Lewis uses is that the devils feast on our souls as if they're drinking them. The devils hate our personality and want to devour, to suck everything into themselves. And this is the kind of subtle evil that Lewis depicts throughout the Screwtape Letters. A few more things and then we'll look at the letters. Lewis, people asked him, how did you come up with these letters? How did you know this? Were you, eavesdropping on the devil? And Lewis said, it was very easy. I just studied my own heart. Right? All of us give way to sin. And Lewis said, I don't talk about any sins in that book that I wasn't tempted to. He will only put sins that he knew the temptations that he sometimes gave into, sometimes didn't give into. And I'm glad he did that. Because the first time any of you have read the Screwtape Letters, you might have been shocked to find that there are very few, quote, big sins in this book. Very little talk about murder, adultery, all these. They're all tiny, petty little sins. But that's what makes this book 100 times more convicting than it would otherwise be. Now, Lewis meant it for a general audience, but Lewis was thinking more about Christians and churchgoers reading this than people that were not believers. And I want to tell you something. If you've ever asked yourself this question, I'm not sure. Am I a Pharisee? I hope not. Am I a Pharisee? I will give you a perfect way of finding out. Read the Screwtape Letters from beginning to end. If you read that book and you can find the sins of all your friends, family members, and neighbors, but you can't find yourself in this book, you are a Pharisee. And if you're laughing, maybe you've read it. Read it. He gets into the mind, to the way we can justify anything. And that's one of the great things about Lewis. Lewis said that even though Screwtape was one of his most successful books, he says, I didn't enjoy writing it. It gave me spiritual cramp, he said. You know, having to put myself in the mind of the devil, it's all ashes and dust, and it exhausted me. And he admitted that somebody really needs to write a sequel to the Screwtape Letters. Now, lots of people have done that, but what they've done is continue writing from Screwtape's point of view. Lewis said what needs to happen is somebody has to write the guardian angel letters and show what the guardian angel was doing for the same patient. Please, who's good enough to write that? Who's angelic? So I didn't feel capable of doing that. And as far as I can tell, nobody's done it. I've not read anything. A lot of people have brought back, I myself did a little Screwtape thing too. But it's how can you do it? But Lewis said that's what we really need, a balance between the two. Finally, one more thing, because I only have time to read a few letters. I want to give you what I think is the central lesson of the Screwtape Letters. And I hope it will inspire you to read it if you haven't read it already. Read it again. I teach this Screwtape Letters every year to each new Honors College freshman class. It's an optional thing. Because we need, if we're going to struggle with choices, morality, and ethics, you need to read Screwtape. Well, we don't get Wormwood's letters. We only get Screwtape's letters. But it's clear that Wormwood has written to his uncle and told him that he wants to capture his patient in a big sin. And Screwtape reacts, oh, Wormwood, you're so young. I remember those young days. I mean, those big sins are fun, really. It's great to watch them squirm. But remember, the big sinners often become the big saints. You remember that jaded party boy, St. Augustine, okay? Watch out. No, Wormwood, it's much better to give your patient a series of little sins, one after another. The problem with the big sin is it might make us wake up to our true condition and seek after grace. But one little sin after another, we don't even notice what's happening. And so he ends the letter by saying, no, Wormwood, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. We don't even know what is happening. And what I'm going to do is read you some selections. I'm going to start by reading all of the first letter, and then I'll read selections from 5 other letters if I have time. And I'll start with the full letter. Now, you need to understand, if you haven't read Screwtape before, that everything is turned upside down. Black is white, white is black. Screwtape is writing from the point of view of the devil. And so whenever he says the enemy, he of course means God. And when he says our Father or our Father below, he means the devil. Do you know when Lewis was publishing this in The Guardian, at least one person wrote a letter to the publisher and said, I am getting rid of my subscription. That advice you've been giving us is perfectly diabolical. Now, this is somebody that doesn't understand Irish. And some people don't get this book. It takes a while to get it. You've got to kind of flip everything around in your head. Now, here is the very first letter. And it should shock you because in this letter, Screwtape doesn't talk about big sins or anything. He talks about reason. So let me read this to you and then we'll talk about it. My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding your patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friends. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. Well, That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not, and if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed, ever since he was a boy, to having a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside of his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think that materialism is strong, or stark, or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. The trouble about arguing, Wormwood, is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. He can argue too. Whereas, in truly practical propaganda, of the kind I am suggesting, he has been shown for centuries to be greatly the inferior of our Father below. By the very act of argument, you awake the patient's reason. And once it is awakened, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experience. Your business is to fix his mind on the stream. Teach him to call it real life. And don't let him ask what he means by real. Remember, he is not like you, a pure spirit. Never having been a human, oh, that abominable advantage of the enemies. You don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, would at his elbow in a moment. Now, if I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was no such fool. I struck instantly at that part of the man which I had best under my control, and I suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. Now, the enemy presumably made the counter suggestion, you know, you can never quite understand what he says to him, that this was more important than lunch. At least I think that must have been the enemy's line, for when I said, quite, in fact, much too important to tackle at the end of a morning, the patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past, and before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got into him an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the newspaper boy and the number 73 bus, was enough to show him that all that sort of thing just couldn't be true. He knew he had a narrow escape, and in later years, he was fond of talking about that inarticulate sense for actuality, which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He is now safe in our Father's house. You begin to see the point, Wormwood. Thanks to processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes. Keep pressing home on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases amongst those quantum physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real life. But the best of all is to not let him read any science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the result of modern investigation. Do remember one, you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose it was our job to teach. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Now, I don't think any of us, if we were writing this book, would start with that letter. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with temptations of the flesh or anything we would immediately think of in our day and age. You see, Lewis wrote this book, we're talking about 70 years ago. And things are actually a little bit better for Christians today, at least in America, than they were 70 years ago. Because Lewis is writing at a time when it's sort of a given that on one side is academia, and that's all about reason and logic and investigation. And on the other side is the emotional, private side, and that's where we dumped religion. Lewis fought hard and made it easier for a lot of Christian academics afterwards to say that no, true reason is on God's side. God created reason. Reason is on God's side, not on the devil's side. You see, what the devil does, what our society does, is they don't want us to think about things as being true or false. Right? The question they ask now is, well, is this progressive or not? That's a totally different question than whether it's true or false, virtuous or vicious. And what he's getting at is in our modern world, academia, the media, all of this sort of stuff, they've gotten us to stop asking the simple, important question of whether something is right or wrong. Now we ask, well, is this the way of the future? Is it outdated? Is it old-fashioned? Well, it might be old-fashioned, but that doesn't tell you anything about whether it's right or wrong, true or false, virtuous or vicious. But again, we are trained not to think that way anymore. You know, when they take polls, they ask secular kids and Christian kids, and everybody says everything's relative. Doesn't make a difference if they grow up in a Christian home. We're sort of taught that everything's relative. There's only what I want to do, what I feel, what's helpful, what's practical. The religion of America, you know, is pragmatism. Do what is practical. That's not the same thing as doing what is right or doing what is wrong. Again, the devil would like to keep us away from thinking about the big questions of life and focusing on our belly. I teach film as well. And one thing that really annoys me, the only thing Lewis lacked was an appreciation for film. No appreciation whatsoever for film. But we'll give him a pass on it. But one thing that really annoys me with movies is when somebody says, oh, I'm going to go see another Martin Scorsese movie about gangsters, as if we need another one, right? And because it's full of sex and profanity and violence, that's real life. I'm not going to watch a musical. That's got nothing to do with real life. What? People don't fall in love in real life? People don't sing in real life? There's no joy? There's no happy ending? What makes something full of four-letter words more real? Okay? But that's what's happening. We have this idea. Keep us focused on the stream and call that real life. And don't focus on the things above. Right? So, again, Lewis is fighting to show who built the university. The Catholic Church that built all the universities, right? They're the ones that want us to move, and all Christians should want us to move and open our mind and come closer. Love the Lord your God with heart, soul, strength, and mind. And let me read another one, a little bit different. We'll move on to letter 9 here. Now I'm just going to read portions because we don't have time to read whole letters. All right. This is amazing. Some people that are shocked when they read Screwtape Letters, In the second letter, Wormwood's patient becomes a Christian. So really the whole book is about trying to tempt a Christian and make him backslide. Now, folks, I'm a Baptist. We're not really talking about whether once saved, always saved. The point is that the person being tempted is a believer. Okay? So we can't, if we're a believer, this doesn't bother me. We're tempted, okay? Try to pull him back. And one of the things Screwtape talks about is in the Christian life, we all go through peaks and troughs. And he wants Wormwood to make use of both of those. And right now, the patient is in a trough. Those moments, the same thing will happen, say, in a wedding. You're full of love, and then you've been married a while, and it's like, oh, I don't feel those warm fuzzies anymore. Relationship with God is a marriage with the bride of Christ in Christianity. And let's use the trough, right? And what he wants to talk about here is the difference between the trough sexuality and the peak sexuality. The difference between the trough, let's say, drunkenness, and the peak drunkenness. And he says something very important, especially for my fellow Baptists. He says that, Wormwood, you are much more likely to make a man a sound drunkard by pressing drink on him as an anodyne when he is dull and weary, than by encouraging him to use it as a means of merriment among his friends when he is happy and expansive. Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. I know we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made the pleasures. All of our research so far has not enabled us to produce one pleasure. All that we can do is to encourage the humans to take the pleasures which our enemy has produced and use them at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. It is more certain, and it's better style. To get the man's soul and give him nothing in return, that is what really gladdens our Father's heart. Have anybody heard someone say, why is it that everything I want to do is either illegal, immoral, or fat? We have this wrong-headed notion that the reason sin is bad is because it's fun. And if you have any kind of sort of puritanical background, we have the idea that anything fun is evil. No. If there's anything wrong with sin, it's that it's unfun. It's not pleasurable at all, because sin draws us away not only from God, but draws us away from our own humanity. All sins, whether sins of the flesh or sins of the soul, all sins eventually become addictions. And how does an addiction work? An addiction to drugs, in the beginning you take a little bit and it gives you a high. But as you get more addicted, you need to take more and more and more, and it gives you less and less pleasure. In the beginning you seek an addiction because it gives you pleasure. Later on you take it to keep away the pain. And then you take it because you can't break out of it. Right? One of my favorite, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Hogarth. He was a British artist from the 18th century, and he made prints. And he made two prints that I've always remembered, Beer Alley and Gin Street. And in Beer Alley, you see kind of Germanic people, they're drinking beer, they're happy, healthy, they're fat. Back then, fat was healthy, not today. They're happy, they're joyous, there's fellowship, all that sort of stuff. Then Gin Alley are all these emaciated people lying down in the streets. Some of them are almost skeletal. Right? There is and I'm sorry I'm a Baptist, but there's a proper use of alcohol and there's an improper use of alcohol. The proper use of alcohol is at a wedding. I think there was this guy named Jesus who actually made wine. He didn't make grape juice, made wine. Okay? The proper use of wine is to, well, it's actually a verse from the Bible. Wine that gladdens the heart. Remember whose favorite verse that was? Father Richard John Newhouse. This is his favorite verse. Wine that gladdens the heart. Right? A bad use of alcohol is in the sort of proverbial smoky bar. You're cut off and isolated from everyone, probably telling lies about your exploits. It is not increasing your humanity, it is decreasing. Let me give you an example of the proper use of alcohol. Now, I don't drink, but that's because I don't need to, okay? I already have a sanguine nature. If I were to drink, it would be actually rather frightening. My father is less loquacious than I am. He's a little bit more quiet. But if we go out to eat or go to a wedding and he has one glass of wine, suddenly he's talking to everyone. This is the proper use of alcohol. First of all, when Jesus was around, there was no such thing as distilled liquor. There was only wine, which was watered down, and there was beer. From the Egyptians invented beer. But for him, a little bit of wine opens him up, as it does for many people. There's a good use of something, and there's a bad use. I am convinced that the devil is a teetotaler, and I think Lewis would agree, okay? Because he doesn't give us drink so we can have fun. The devils hate fun. The devils hate life. They give it to us so we can be addicted, and so that our life can be crushed. And Lewis is so important in showing us that. I'm going to give you one more example before I move on. I love all movies. I've seen everything, silent, all of them. But if there's one era that I absolutely despise, it's the movies from the 1970s. I despise them. I know that the critics like them. And one of the things that I really hate about them, now look, there are movies that I love that are sadly about adultery. I'm thinking, of course, of Dr. Zhivago. But at least in Dr. Zhivago, there's some sense here that there's this huge thing going on. The people at least feel bad. All of this sort of stuff, okay? Being mean to Charlie Chaplin's daughter, that's really nasty. But in the 70s movies, people have affairs because they have nothing to do that weekend. I don't know if you've seen any of these horrible movies, okay? Terrible, terrible stuff. And again, there is no life, there's no joy, okay? If you ask most Baptists what their favorite verse is, it will be John 3:16. But my favorite, I like John 3:16. But my favorite is John 10:10, right? The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But I come, Jesus comes, that you might have life and have it to the full. Again, Lewis is brilliant, like Dante. He shows the devils as being anti-life and anti-joy. Let's move on to another letter. Let's see. Okay. This is a little bit about living in time and living the spiritual life. Wormwood says, the humans live in time, but our enemy destines them to eternity. He therefore, I believe, wants them to attend chiefly to two things: to eternity itself, and to that point of time which they call the present. For the present is the point at which time touches eternity. Of the present moment, and of it only, humans have an experience analogous to the experience which our enemy has of reality as a whole. In it alone, freedom and actuality are offered them. The enemy would therefore have the humans continually concerned either with eternity, which means being concerned with him, or with the present, either meditating on their eternal union with or separation from himself, or else obeying the present voice of conscience, bearing the present cross, receiving the present grace, giving thanks for the present pleasure. I harbor a deep hatred for Nike sneakers. Why? It's nothing to do with the sneakers. I don't even know if they're any good. I harbor a hatred because they popularized a phrase, live in the now. You all seen it? That was, and not as much today, but in the past, that was their logo. Live in the now. Now, why does that make me hate Nike? It makes me hate Nike because they have perverted a phrase which is truly Christian. Every Christian, that should be their motto, live in the now. In the Lord's Prayer, we say, give us this day our daily bread. Christians are to live like the Jews in the wilderness, day by day, following God. And remember, if you know the story, they don't know when they're going to stop. They're following the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. Whenever it stopped, they would get down, put up their tents, and they would stay until it moved again. Right? Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, each day has enough troubles of its own. We are to live now in the present. Unfortunately, when Nike says live in the now, they're not thinking about the, I'll give you a fancy word, the eschatological now of the Sermon on the Mount. They're thinking about the now of absolute pleasure and consumerism, and I want an Oompa Loompa, and I want it now. That's what they mean by live in the now. So they have perverted something that is the way the spiritual person should live. Live now, in the present. Not always worrying about the future or feeling regret about the past, but living now with the daily grace that God gives us to live day by day. That is the way a Christian's supposed to live. Okay, let me say one more thing here about time. Now, to be sure, the enemy wants men to think of the future too, just so much as is necessary for now planning the acts of justice or charity, which will probably be their duty tomorrow. The duty of planning tomorrow's work is today's duty. Though its material is borrowed from the future, the duty, like all duties, is in the present. This is no straw-splitting rule. The enemy does not want men to give the future their hearts, to place their treasure in it. That's what we want. His ideal is a man who, having worked all day for the good of posterity, if that is his vocation, washes his mind of the whole subject, commits the issue to heaven, and returns at once to the patience or gratitude demanded by the moment that is passing over him. We want a man hag-ridden by the future, haunted by visions of an imminent heaven or an imminent hell on earth, ready to break the enemy's commands in the present if, by so doing, we make him think he can attain the one or avert the other, dependent for his faith on the success or failure of schemes which he will not live to see the end of. World, we want a race perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end, never honest, nor kind, nor happy now, but always using as mere fuel wherewith to heat the altar of the future every real gift which is offered them in the present. Most of the horrors of the 20th century, and you do understand the 20th century was the most brutal and horrific in the history of the world, is because people, both from the extreme right, totalitarian, fascist, and to the extreme left, communism, all of them felt like they were building utopia. And they felt that the future was so important, whether you call it the pure communism worker state, whether you call it the Aryan race, that utopia was so important that it justified killing and destroying anything in order to get there. We need to realize this is the craziest thing, but the one Christian doctrine that has saved the human race from more misery and horror is the doctrine of original sin. G.K. Chesterton talks about this and influenced Lewis on this point, right? That means we're made in God's image, but we're fallen. And because we're fallen, we cannot build utopia. But modern people, starting with Rousseau, said, no, man is good, but he's corrupted by society. So all we have to do is re-educate him, and then we'll have utopia. Unfortunately, re-education usually means re-education camps. It means the gulag. It means killing people that are too corrupted. Again, we need to live now. We don't live for the future. A lot of people, make decisions based on the future, not knowing that their decisions today are what make the future. We need to live now. Again, this is a powerful book. Even if you're not a religious person, I would encourage you to read this book because it will open your eyes and challenge you about how to live your life. Do a few more. Or are we doing on time? One more time? Do a few more. Okay, let's move to another letter. And I really like this letter. In The Weight of Glory, Lewis's greatest sermon, he says that if you asked people 100 years ago what the greatest Christian virtue was, they would tell you love or charity or caritas. If you ask anybody today, they would say the greatest virtue is unselfishness. If Lewis was writing today, he would probably say, ask someone today, and they would say tolerance. Notice that we've taken a positive virtue, love or charity, and replaced it with a negative virtue, unselfishness, or again, in modern day terms, tolerance. C.S. Lewis, or Screwtape here, has fun with this. He says, the grand problem is that of unselfishness. Note, once again, woman, the admirable work of our philological on in substituting the negative unselfishness for the enemy's positive charity. Thanks to this, you can, from the very outset, teach a man to surrender benefits, not that others may be happy in having them, but that he may be unselfish in foregoing them. This is a great point gained. Another great help, where the parties concerned are male and female, is the divergence of view about unselfishness which we have built up between the sexes. A woman means by unselfishness chiefly taking trouble for others. A man means by unselfishness not giving trouble to others. As a result, a woman who is quite far gone in the enemy's service will make a nuisance of herself on a larger scale than any man, except those whom our Father has dominated completely. Contrariwise, a man will live long in the enemy's camp before he undertakes as much spontaneous work to please others as a quite ordinary woman may do every day. Thus, while the woman thinks of doing good offices and the man of respecting other people's rights, each sex, without any obvious unreason, can and does regard the other as radically selfish. Two things here. First of all, we all know the difference, right? If somebody is extending any kind of charity to you, every one of us knows immediately whether that person is doing it out of true and sincere love for us, or because they feel some kind of duty that will make them feel better about themselves if they hand it. Right? We know that. We see it. We often don't see it in ourselves, but we see it in other people. Okay? Love, not charity. Love is moving out of yourself. Right? I mean, if you're working at a soup kitchen, and after 10 years, you still hate and despise the people you're helping, there's something wrong. Okay? There's something wrong. You're not learning charity. You are just thinking that you're more holy by flagellating yourself. If you are truly in a spirit of charity, sooner or later, you will come to feel real compassion for these people. You might still get upset or whatnot. But again, see, in America, we have this idea that it's not charity unless we're miserable when we do it. Right? You saw the movie Amistad by Steven Spielberg. There's a great scene where the black people are in prison, the slaves who are trying to escape from their prison, and the abolitionists walk by, right? And one of the slaves says to the other one, Are those the ones they call Christians? He says, yes. Why do they always look so miserable? Okay, there's a problem here. It's a problem here. But the part that's funny is about the male and female versions of unselfishness. And if you are married, you better have immediately recognized this, okay? A woman means by unselfish, helping everybody out. A man says, no, I'm not putting my nose in it. And you know what Lewis said in another book? He said, if there's a purgatory, a husband and wife will be in this room in purgatory sitting when suddenly they'll hear the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen. The woman will not be allowed to get up and see what's going on. The man will have to get up and see what's going on. Right? Now you understand what he's talking about. Now, I have been a college professor for 23 years. I was a teaching assistant a little before that. I want to tell you that, and I'm not exaggerating, I think the most destructive thing that is being taught to your children these days, in high school and college, sometimes even Christian colleges, is this nonsensical notion that men and women are exactly the same, and the only reason they're different is because of socialization. This is taught in philosophy, and rather psychology, and sociology classes all over the country, even in Christian ones. Okay? We are different. See, modern people teach us that there's no such thing as masculine and feminine. Those are just social constructs. That's why they substituted the word sex for the word gender. Don't use the word gender, okay? That's a jargon word that means there's no such thing as masculine and feminine. There's only what society is. No. And folks, until you understand and take joy in the differences between men and women, you're not going to have as good a marriage. Okay? Because if you don't try to understand that men and women interface with the world differently, you're going to get mad at each other all the time. Okay? You need to understand that. And Lewis kind of plays with this in many of his writings. Now let's move on from the couple that are doing the unselfishness to a family. And folks, even those of you that are very good better recognize this immediately. We'll start with the couple. What the devil does to get the couple in trouble is the following. Okay. In discussing any joint action, it becomes obligatory that A, let's say the husband, should argue in favor of B, the wife's supposed wishes, and against his own, while B does the opposite. It is often impossible to find out either party's real wishes. With luck, they end up by doing something that neither wants, while each feels a glow of self-righteousness and harbors a secret claim to preferential treatment for the unselfishness shown, and a secret grudge against the other for the ease with which the sacrifice has been accepted. Later on, you can venture on to what may be called the generous conflict illusion. Now, this game is best played with more than 2 players, in a family with grown-up children, for example. Something quite trivial, like having tea in the garden, is proposed. One member takes care to make it quite clear, though not in so many words, that he would rather not do that, but is of course prepared to do so out of unselfishness. The others instantly withdraw their proposal, ostensibly through their unselfishness, but really because they don't want to be used as a sort of lay figure on which the first speaker practices petty altruisms. But he is not going to be done out of his debauch of unselfishness either. He insists on doing what the others want. They insist on doing what he wants. Passions are roused. Soon someone is saying, "Well, let it go. We won't have tea at all." And then a real quarrel ensues with bitter resentment on both sides. You see how it is done, Wormwood? If each side had been frankly contending for its own real wish, they all would have kept within the bounds of reason and courtesy. But just because the contention is reversed, and each side is fighting the other side's battle, all the bitterness, which really flows from thwarted self-righteousness and obstinacy and from the accumulated grudges of the last 10 years, is concealed from them by the nominal or official unselfishness of what they are doing. Each side is indeed quite alive to the cheap quality of the adversary's selfishness and of the false position into which he is trying to force them. But each manages to feel blameless and ill-used itself, but with no more dishonesty than comes now. Have you all recognized the generous conflict illusion? Are we not guilty of this? Okay, well, I don't really want to, but I'll do it for you. No, I'll do it for you, back and forth. And it's so nasty, right? Nasty. Especially when you're young kids, you tend to see through that right away, right? The good people, we don't do the big sins, but we do sins. And see, what Lewis shows us through Screwtape is the problem with us human beings is we can justify anything to ourselves. In fact, not only can we take something bad that we're doing and justify ourselves that it's not bad, we can actually convince ourselves that it's good. In other words, no, this is not gossip, it's a prayer request. You see? It's not bad, it is now good. You're going to say something, usually guys do this, you're going to say something that will hurt somebody, but I'm just being truthful, and the Bible says I shouldn't lie. You see it? Okay? This is the game the devil. There's another letter where where Wormwood says, "I'm really nervous, Screwtape, my patient has become humble." And Screwtape says, "I see your patient has become humble." Have you let him know that, right? Have you drawn his attention? Because as soon as you start saying, "By gum, I'm humble," you're suddenly being prideful. We have time for 2 more? Throw it. We do 2 more. There's so much in this book. It's just wonderful. Let's move on. Like I said, 2 more. Okay. In this part, Screwtape is talking about something that I don't have time to go into it. But basically, what he's saying is that this is a kind of a secret that the devils are trying to keep from the people. But if the people, us, the humans, if we read old books like Boethius, we would know right away. We would see through the devil's ploys. I mean, if we all really read Augustine and Aquinas, also Plato and Aristotle, we should see through most of the devil's temptations with ease. But that doesn't happen anymore. And Screwtape is going to explain why. And if I had to choose my favorite passage, it would probably be this one. Because what I'm going to read to you right now, if you ask me, if you could make one change to academia, particularly secular academia, that would make it a better place, what would it be? It's going to be this. Let me read this to you and show how the devils prevent us from learning from the past. He says, in the modern world we have created, only the learned read old books. And we have now so dealt with the learned that they are, of all men, the least likely to acquire wisdom by reading the old books. How have we done this, you ask? We have done this by inculcating the historical point of view. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when a learned man is presented with any statement in an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it is true. Now, he will ask who influenced the ancient writer, or how far the statement is consistent with what he said in other books, or what phase in the writer's development, or the general history of thought it illustrates, or how it affected later writers, or how often it has been misunderstood, especially by the learned man's colleagues, or what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, or what is the present state of the question. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify your thoughts or your behavior, this would be rejected as unutterably simple-minded. And since we cannot deceive the whole human race all the time, it is most important that we cut every generation off from all others. For where learning makes a free colors between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But thanks to our Father below and the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanic who holds that history is bunk. Let me explain this, because this really is at the very core of the problem of the modern university. If you are at a university and you're studying, let's say, Dante, I'm lecturing on Dante right now to the Honors College sophomores, probably one of my favorite works. If you take those classes, they will ask all sorts of things about Dante. Like you just said here, when was it written, what were the influences, who did it influence, etc., all these questions. But there's one question that will never be asked in the modern academia. Is what Dante said true? That really would be considered unutterably naive to ask that, even bourgeois to ask that question. Folks, until we ask that question, is what Dante or Shakespeare or Plato said true? Until we ask that question, we will not be changed at all by what we're reading. It is only once we ask the question, is it true, that we might change our ideas, and God forbid, we might change our behavior. So many professors who have access to the greatest knowledge ever there are the people who can't do anything with it. Because we put them. That is why I've spoken at some academic conferences, but I don't enjoy that. I enjoy speaking to real people. What do I mean by that? When you go to an academic conference too often, nobody's there to learn from Shakespeare. That would be naive. We're there to set Shakespeare straight, to show how much wiser we are than him. There's a sort of arrogance thing. This idea of learning at the feet of great writers is considered foolish and naive in modern academia. We need to go back, and folks, I'm not just talking about being challenged by Christian writers. I mean Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, as Lewis himself was. Almost everything Lewis wrote about ethics comes right out of Aristotle. I mean, through Aquinas, but it goes all the way back to Aristotle. Finally, let me just end with one last thing. Okay. This is being written during World War II, right? So the Nazis are bombing, what we call the Battle of Britain. And Wormwood is kind of hoping that a bomb will fall on his patient and kill him. And Screwtape says, no. That's the last thing you want. His patient is like in his 20s, he's younger. And this is what he says. Wormwood, you should be guarding your patient like the apple of your eye. If he dies now, you lose him. If he survives the war, there is always hope. The enemy has guarded him from you through the first great wave of temptations. But if only he can be kept alive, you have time itself as your ally. The long, dull, monotonous years of middle-aged prosperity or middle-aged adversity are excellent campaigning weather. You see, it is so hard for these creatures to persevere. The routine of adversity, the gradual decay of youthful loves and youthful hopes, the quiet despair, I felt this pain, of ever overcoming the chronic temptations with which we have again and again defeated them, the drabness which we create in their lives, and the inarticulate resentment with which we teach them to respond to it. All this provides admirable opportunities of wearing out a soul by attrition. If, on the other hand, the middle years prove prosperous, our position is even stronger. Prosperity knits a man to the world. He feels that he is finding his place in it, while really it is finding its place in him. His increasing reputation, his widening circle of acquaintances, his sense of importance, the growing pressure of absorbing an agreeable work, build up in him a sense of being really at home on earth, which is just what we want. You will notice, world, that the young are generally less unwilling to die than the middle-aged. I'm sure you're all familiar with the parable of the sower. The sower sows the seed. Some of it falls along the path, immediately devoured by the birds. Some falls in the shallow ground and grows up quickly, but because it has no root, when the sun comes out, it's burnt. And then some falls along the thorns. Now, the ones that fall along the path are those that accept the Lord kind of at an emotional high, but when persecution comes, they forsake Him. But what about the thorns? What happens is, as the seed grows up, the thorns choke it, and it bears no fruit. Now, if you read Jesus' explanation, he says, oddly, that the thorns represent the pleasures and adversities of life. Lewis is very subtly picking up on this. We can have our spiritual life crushed out both by middle-aged prosperity and by middle-aged adversity. I just turned 50. Am I allowed to call myself middle-aged? Am I going to live to 100? I don't think so. When you get older, middle age gets pushed up. I'm sure there are many of you in your 60s who are convinced you're middle-aged. Maybe you'll make it to 120. Maybe eat your yogurt or whatever. Understand that either way, middle-aged adversity gets us because it wears us down. World War I was a war of attrition, right? Kill more of them than of you and you beat them, right? Lewis actually fought in World War I. We understand that. But middle-aged prosperity, okay? Those of you that are middle-aged, here's a great challenge for you. And I feel this challenge myself. As we get older, and if we're successful in our family, our career, we start saying to ourselves, I am finding my place in the world at last. But you know what's really happening? The world is finding its place in us. That's a strong challenge. And the last challenge, and again, Lewis has these pearls that just come out of nowhere. If I ask you, who is more likely to be willing to be a martyr? A 25-year-old or a 75-year-old? A lot of people will answer quickly the 75-year-old because he doesn't have much more time to live. He's lived a long life. Certainly, the young person doesn't want to die. But generally speaking, the young are more willing to be martyrs. Now, part of that, my students, is because you really have no life. You see what I mean, okay? But almost all the terrorists, the suicide, they're all young, okay? Let me leave you with this image, and this will blow your mind, okay? I'm going to say something, and I want you to just get a visual image in your mind. Daniel in the lion's den. Get an image in your mind. Daniel in the lion's den. If you're like most of us, the image you just had was of a strapping young 25-year-old, real strong, loving God. He's down there with the lions. Read the Bible carefully, the book of Daniel, and you will discover that when Daniel was thrown in the lion's den, he was about 80 years old. Did the picture just shift for you? Is it suddenly a different story? Because it is. Now, when Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they were about 25 or so. But this is 50 years later. The Persians have defeated the Babylonians and we're into the Persian Empire. So he is about 80 years old. Again, sometimes we're less willing because we get so tied up in the world, we don't want to let go anymore. Right? In another letter, Screwtape says, darn it, these young people, we can't get them focused on the future because there are so many traps of beautiful music, the face of a lovely girl, and off they go, and they just will not pay attention to their career and building things up and building a lasting value. But as we get older, again, it starts to look more attractive. Now, obviously, we have to take care of our family, but it's so easy to get trampled up in the world. So again, I would encourage you, if you haven't read Screwtape, read it. If you've read it before, read it again. I've taught it now to 6 years in a row to each new freshman class of honors club. I never get tired of it. If you are fans of Focus on the Family, they have taken the Screwtape Letters and turned it into a radio play. I really encourage you to buy it from Focus on the Family or Amazon, and it acts it out in a powerful, dramatic way. I guess I better stop there. Thank you. And if you have any questions one-on-one, just go up there and ask me, so I don't want to keep you here too late. And I believe we have some refreshments, or no? Yes, okay. So, again, thank you, and I'll see you outside.
Screwtape Letters is a profound meditation on the deep theological significance of the human relationships with the realities of the world, including material reality in its most banal aspects. Not by chance, among Lewis's books, the Screwtape Letters was the favorite of the late Monsignor Luigi Giussani, who once wrote, "What is the formula for the journey to the ultimate meaning of reality? Living the real." There is an experience of an arcane, mysterious presence to be found within the opening of the eye, within the attraction we are awakened by things, within the beauty of things. This basic truth is echoed many times in the passages by Lewis that we heard tonight. We warmly thank Houston Baptist University, the University of St. Thomas, Dr. Aquila, Dr. Markos. If you are interested in Crossroads, please leave your business card at the reception area. Be sure to sign in. You can find more information about us on our program. And then finally, an event as beautiful as this has many expenses. We welcome your contributions. Thank you and good night.